We are available on Spotify and YouTube, so don't forget to subscribe for our latest episode.
This podcast is lit.
If you have low test scores, I feel bad for you, son. I got 99 problems, but my class ain't one.
99 problems, but my class ain't one. If your test scores are low, I feel bad for you, son. I got 99 problems, but my class ain't one.
Hello and welcome to This Podcast is Lit podcast. And this week we've got a really good poem for you. We've got Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. In the studio today are the usual suspects. Miss Ray, hello miss.
Hey.
Mr. Ackroyd, hello sir.
Hiya.
And DJ Zoom.
Hello.
How you doing, Mr. Zoom?
Yeah, not bad. Nice sunny day today. Not going to go out though, so.
There we go. So today we're discussing the poem Kamikaze. Mr. Ackroyd, what are your feelings on this poem before we start?
Yeah, I like the poem. I struggle with it, as you know, probably from experience of talking to me in terms of getting the narrative structure right about it. But I think I've probably read this poem as much as anyone in the world, including Beatrice Garland.
Potentially combined as well.
I've got so many different readings of it. My head's a bit jumbled up a little bit, but I do like it. It's there's lots of imagery in there.
Yeah.
I did get to a point where I started to critique it in terms of cultural appropriation. I'd started reading it so many times, but I've kind of persuaded myself out of that one, and I'm left with a feeling it's a really good poem.
I feel like with some poems, what the authors are trying to achieve are more obvious than this poem. I think there's an obvious potential interpretation of this poem, but I feel like, as you just pointed out, there are so many other ways we could take this, that to actually have a specific reading can be difficult. And I do feel for students sometimes. In the exam, I probably have about 25 minutes to write about a poem like this, and I think that would be quite challenging in some ways, and maybe students need to stick with one or two interpretations and try and do it justice. I'm not sure. Miss Ray, what are your feelings about the poem?
No, I agree. I think going into a couple of interpretations in depth is always going to be a lot more impressive than like doing lots of different alternative interpretations superficially. I agree with everything Mr. Ackroyd said. I think it's quite a tricky poem to work out the story and to kind of like walk yourself through. But just in terms of the imagery, some of the imagery is just phenomenal. That I just love it. It's poetry because of the complexity of the emotion combined with the imagery. It's gorgeous poem.
And who's the actual speaker of the poem, Mr. Ackroyd? Mr. Ackroyd spent many an hour in my classroom, sort of well after school hours, as it's getting dark outside, pontificating who the actual speaker of the poem is.
Do you want to talk about this now, or do we talk about this in the structure? Because it could go on for a while. Maybe
we'll talk about structure, baby, a bit later.
Yeah.
Can we have a time limit on structure?
We'll discover that, but I've got it in my head. You know that I've always thought, and I've persuaded myself that it's true what I thought originally.
Okay, well, you got me on tenterhooks for the structure section later. Okay, then let's start off with poem in a headline. And Miss Ray, off you go.
I've gone quite simple this week. I think I always go simple on these, actually. I've gone for Man Returns Home to No Welcome, because I think that foregrounds what the entire poem is about. The poem is about the man. It is about him returning and against everything that he should be doing. But I like to use the word home in my headline because he does return home, and home gives you connotations of safety and your family and love. And it's completely the opposite to what he receives when he gets home. And I just like the play on the hero's welcome, no welcome thing that I've also included.
Nice. Mr. Ackroyd, poem in a headline.
Yeah, well, I struggled with the headline for this one. I've done a few and I didn't like them. I did, no. I did The Living Death of a Courageous Coward. No, what if I can't even remember right? The Living Death of a Cowardly Champion. The Lamentable Tale of a True Warrior, but I didn't like them, so I've come up.
Are they two separate headlines?
Yeah, two separate ones. Yeah, what I keep coming back to is the choice and the dichotomy. So what I've gone for is what a terrible world, what a beautiful world, because I think the poem is the dichotomy of the terrible things that this culture done to this man who defied the emperor, but within that, the beautiful world of the nature that persuaded him to turn home.
Nice. Okay, so just to make it clear, which one are you trying to get marks for?
What a terrible world, what a beautiful world.
Is DJ Zoom actually listening as well? Do we want to double check?
Yeah, make sure we shake him or something. From a socially... Oh yeah, he's making
he's
notes.
Oh, he's writing things
Yeah,
down!
Wow. I hope you didn't write down everything I just said then, because I was rambling on.
Very impressive, DJ Zoom. Okay, so my poem in a headline is dead from the outset, dead at the finish. And the reason why I tried to put that is because, I don't know, I just thought the ending to this poem is quite ironic. Surely this speaker feels guilt. This poem sort of shows these ideas that nationalism and pride are very dangerous things. And this man, this kamikaze pilot, is dead. Really, from the even before this poem starts, it starts with him getting in the plane, but he's dead before then. It doesn't really matter. He has no choice. He has no freedom. This is a country devoid of democracy, and you can see that. It asks at the end, how did he die? Which is the best way to die? And I suppose my headline is trying to prove that in my head, he was already dead. In an alternative or parallel universe, he'd be lauded for being brave, like Mr. Ackroyd just said, for going against the emperor's demands. But not in this society. Not in this society. It's best to follow orders. And like I say, really, your fate is sealed long before you get the choice to have any personal ideas. DJ Zoom with the scores.
Okay, so all very similar scores this week. Everybody gets a 4. Miss Ray's one, definitely very nice. The idea of the home, not really coming back to any welcome. Yeah, very important that the fact he comes home and he's got nothing. I would have given more points to Mr. Ackroyd if he stuck with his living death of a cowardly champion. I thought that was really interesting point to make about the poem, how he kind of comes back a champion of life, but he gets nothing for it because he's labelled a coward in the eyes of his family.
Well, you could just give me 5 points for 2 good headlines rather than 4 points for 1 headline for everyone else.
He could do a lot of things, Mr. Ackroyd, doesn't he?
Do you know what, Mr. Ackroyd? We could all come with 5 headlines next week.
It could all come with 5 headlines, but no, you get 4.
Well, if you're not going to give me any points, why even mention the cowardly? Just mention it. Just give me the points and explain the headline that I just did.
No.
Can we just start taking points off at this stage?
Yeah.
No, I've been a bit naughty. I've been a bit naughty now. Sorry.
That's got to be a point off. That's got to be a point
come on, hit him where it hurts. That's got to be 3 points now.
I'll be nice in this week. I'll leave that at 4.
Oh, DJ Zoom, I'm disappointed. I've taught you nothing over 9 years of friendship. Yeah.
And then Mr. Perkins also 4 points. Again, very important, the idea that dead from the outset, dead from the finish, and he's kind of dead throughout the poem. So also 4 points for that.
Fantastic. What is the most important quote and why? What is the most important quote and why? Mr. Ackroyd, to kick us off, please.
I like full of powerful incantations for a few reasons. One, I think the actual sound, the cadence of it is very clever. The full is repeated, full of powerful incantations, and the incantations is like a spell. So the actual speaking of the line almost sounds like a spell. Very clever. Also, that word incantations, which we always tell students to zoom into, I think is the most important word in the poem, because we're talking about brainwashing. He was brainwashed by the propaganda of the Japanese Empire. And there's elements of dark magic happening here as well. And he is under a spell. And in terms of the language and the further metaphor, brainwash is an extended metaphor in the poem as well, as later on, the culture shows the brainwashing of the children and how the daughter was brainwashed by the power of propaganda. And I think this is a key quote, so students don't forget that brainwashing and propaganda actually led for this young man to consider himself a suicide bomber.
Okay, well, my most important quote and why is going to get straight on the back of what Mr. Ackroyd said. So my quote is going to be, she thought, new line, recounting it later to her children. And all of my notes do sort of sum up what Mr. Ackroyd just said. It was a bit cheeky, analysing other things in the poem other than just his quote. Yeah, absolutely. So we've got the children, the family being brainwashed in this particular quote. The fact that there's enjambment here, she thought, new line, recounting it later to her children. I like the way that she thought is placed on the end of a line without that full stop, because we can see her thought processes here, but there's a lack of certainty. The fact she's only thinking, there's that sort of judgment in there. And the fact that then moves on to a new line showing the enjambment, the pace of everything, it's all got out of control very quickly here. She's just telling a story to her children. But why is this story so powerful? She is condemning him to a life of misery and isolation with a story. And it's a story that she's not even 100% certain about herself, such as the brainwashing. The power is too much for the family to take. Miss Ray.
I've gone for we too learned to be silent. And I've gone that because I love having a quote in which students can zoom in onto every word. So I've gone for the we too learn to be silent because it starts off with the we, and I think that's really important. It's the plural, it's emphasising the fact that it's everyone. It's not just a couple of people that ignore this man when he returned home, it's literally everyone, which then in turn reinforces how isolated he became. And then the word learned. If you're learning something, it implies that you're being taught something. And to be taught something, that implies that it's intentional. So it's an intentional decision to ostracize this man who came back alive. And then to be silent. Now, the word silence is really interesting because it does remind us of death. It does remind us of that kind of end of things and nothing happening. But it also reminds me of things like 2 minute silence, where actually we do think about respect and we do think about paying respects to people that have died. So I think there's an interesting almost juxtaposition there of being silent and saying nothing, but then of also respectful. And I think that quote just encapsulates the entire power of culture and of shame this poem talks about.
DJ Zoom with the scores.
Oh, you guys aren't making it easy this week. They're all really good quotes, and I can't really fault either of them. You really analysed them quite well this week. Full of power incantations definitely is really important to this poem. The idea of the spell and that he's under the spell as well as the family, I feel. So for Mr. Ackroyd, 5 points. Nice analysis of the enjambment by Mr. Firkins, that lack of uncertainty, that loss of control. Again, I can't fault it at 5 points. And we too learn to be silent. Miss Ray's analysis on zooming in with those specific words, the we and silent, and that extra layer of meaning, respect in silence, and then they're taught to think like this. So all of them all together, they get 5 points each.
Wow, so getting into the last round, it's all to play for. Everybody's equal.
You know what happens if you sit on the fence, DJ Zoom?
We have our first ever draw.
Then you get splintered in your butt, DJ Zoom.
Let's talk about structure, baby.
Okay, well, it's time to talk about structure. So let's do that with Mr. Ackroyd and kick us off.
Right. Well, I've always had a problem with this poem because I've always read it. I've always read it a certain way, and a lot of the research that I've done, and from other teachers as well, suggests that I was researching it in the wrong way. But first of all, I've gone with my own thoughts on it. The beginning of the poem and the end of the poem is not the daughter. There are 4 generations of. It gets complicated. There are 4 generations in this poem. There's the daughter, her father, her grandfather, and then the daughter's children. Okay, so there's 4 generations. But if you look at that first bit, her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, right up until the quote that you gave, Mr. Firkins. That's a narrator. Up until but halfway there. That's the narrator giving a backstory. Now, the rest of the poem is the daughter. She thought, because now we're going into the daughter's head. And then the daughter goes into the first person in italics. But the last 2 lines are not in italics. And I think the last 2 lines is also the narrator, where the narrator says, and sometimes she said he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So it's like a story within a story. The narrator starts it, frames it, then gives us the daughter's thought process, and then ends it with a question for the audience. And I'm convinced this is the narration of the poem. Either way, it's quite a tricky one, isn't it, Miss Ray?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've looked at it in the kind of the big wide world of it, and actually I quite like that. I quite like the idea that this story is being told through many different voices, because it's almost like, actually, if this had happened in your family, would you have sat down and told somebody this, or would actually you have to kind of puzzle it together through lots of pieces from everybody else? And that's almost, it seems, what's happening in this poem, that this story, this narrative is being puzzled together.
It creates a distance, doesn't it? And a distance that foreshadows the cultural distance that the man ends up getting from his own family.
Yeah, absolutely.
But just for students as well, there are only 3 sentences in the poem. The first sentence is a very long sentence. So I think these are the things that students need to look at and analyse a little bit. Yeah. And the idea of the 6 stanzas, the 6-line stanzas, 7 6-line stanzas, quite tight controlled, but within that there's free verse. So the tight structure of the Japanese society, juxtaposed with the chaos going in the actual Kamikaze pilot's mind.
Absolutely.
What you fools don't know, what you two fools don't know, and what you two fools don't know is the fact that I think I'm tying on a little bit to what you were saying about structure. I think what you two fools don't know is that this is a poem about so much more than a kamikaze pilot, as it so often is. This poem is about free will, and it's about freedom of choice, and it is about democracy. And you can see that in the middle of the poem. You can look at the central language used by Garland when she's using adjectives such as green and blue and translucent. You've got the 5 senses being used with touch, you've got feathery, you've got taste, you've got salty. I think the translucent was quite an interesting word, which I'll come back to. It's this moment of clarity, isn't it, where he actually realises that he's made the wrong decision, that he wants to carry on living, that he doesn't necessarily want to give his life away. And it's that moment of clarity where he had the opportunity to have a free choice. It's beautiful. That's where the beautiful natural imagery comes in. Humans naturally are supposed to be making decisions. We've got brains, not necessarily supposed to just sit there mindlessly following orders. And it's that moment where he finally isn't just mindlessly following instructions and orders, where we get that beauty. The rest of the poem, there's not a lot of natural and beautiful imagery elsewhere, actually, especially by the end where it all gets rather dark. So that's why you two fools don't know. Miss Ray, you next, please.
So I've decided this week to talk about the symbolism of fish in Japanese culture. So there is a part of the poem where Garland writes about the pilot looking down and being able to spot these fish in the ocean. And I think that's a really powerful piece of imagery, but I wanted to zoom in specifically and look at the link between fish and Japanese culture. So fish in Japanese culture, they tend to represent things like advancement, and that's not necessarily advancement just in material things, but also in your spiritual self as well. So the idea that she's chosen to use something in her poem that represents a spiritual journey, which I think is incredibly interesting. They also represent adversity, which I thought, again, given the content of the poem, was really interesting. But then I wanted to zoom in to koi fish a little bit as well. Now, it's almost certainly not koi that's in the ocean, I know, but I thought this is still worth thinking about. So I found a story that is a bit of a legend centered around a koi fish. And it is said that if koi fish are caught by a fisherman, they face death bravely. They will literally just lay there and wait to be killed, almost like a samurai. And I thought that was an incredibly interesting comparison, given the references to samurais that Garland makes as well. But also the fact that koi swim upstream. It's almost like they're on a mission. It's always like they are fighting against everything that they should be doing to swim upstream. And it's about that innate power.
Nice, okay then. So DJ Zoom, we were all even. It was all level sailing, level pegging. And now it's time for DJ Zoom.
What about
Mr. Ackroyd?
What about my...
Is he not playing?
Oh, right. Whoops. Sorry, I forgot.
Are you not listening, Mr. Perkins? Are you not listening? We had DJ Zoom not listening before. You're not listening now.
I normally skip through this little 10-minute section at the end.
Know your place, Mr. Ackroyd.
Almost forgot it existed.
I'll make it extra long just for you, Mr. Perkins, in that case. Okay, well, I think a little bit Mr. Perkins has alluded to it, but most of the power and conflict poems in this cluster focus on kind of man's eternal battle with nature. So they're locked in some kind of everlasting struggle. This one's slightly different. I actually think nature and man are working together in this one. Nature's working for the benefit of man. It's actually nature that persuades the man to turn around, and that stands out in the power and cluster conflict. This man was brainwashed, and the poem reflects that, you know, it was nature that actually persuaded him to turn around. But specifically, going back to Miss Ray's point, the water and the fish, and I think this is really forgotten by teachers and students. We focus on the shame, we focus on the cultural aspect. This man saved thousands of lives. We forget about that. Woo! Kamikaze pilots, their job was to fly into aircraft carriers, which had lots of soldiers stationed. And by turning round, he, to me, personally as a hero, he saved, self-sacrifice saved so many lives. Did the fisherman, his grandfather, did that remind him of the sailors on the aircraft carrier, that this is life, nature telling him life is precious, turn around? And I slightly disagree with Mr. Firkins' point earlier on. We don't get the pilot's voice in this. We only get the daughter's voice, imagining. And I think we pick up on the daughter's shame of her being silent. I actually like to think, whether I'm right or wrong, I like to think that he was happy with his choice. Yes, he was shunned by society, but I would find comfort in knowing that I saved thousands of lives. And I actually think this is further reinforced by the fact the daughter is now beginning to share her story with the grandchildren, that she can now tell this story, that actually what he did was the right thing. He's a true warrior, defied an emperor in self-sacrifice to save countless lives. I can go on for a bit longer if you want, Mr. Firkins.
No, I thought you did well with that. Nicely timed.
Yeah, let's not go any longer. Okay, so the scores are thus. With 8 points is Mr. Firkins. Nice idea. The free will and the other democracy and the translucent idea. That's a moment of clarity in there, and I think it's something to definitely look towards using as part of their analysis. Great point. I've never really picked up on the symbolism of the fish too much, but definitely have that cultural thing we should bring into it when we analyse this poem. And it's stored the koi carp, very interesting for me. That's something I've learned new today, Miss Ray. Thank you very much. That's 9 points. But Mr. Ackroyd's idea, this one kind of, there was a moment of clarity there for me where he actually saved thousands of lives. I never thought of it in that respect, that by sacrificing his own dignity, so to speak, he saved thousands of other lives. And it's a shame that he was shunned by his family for being so much of a hero in a sense. And there's a hero that they've forgotten, and there's a culture that kind of ruins it for him, doesn't it? So for you, Mr. Ackroyd, 10 points.
Wow, the guys pulled out the bag last but not least there.
I've never seen
and now we know why you were scared to go to me, Mr. Perkins. It's all come to light. It's all come to light.
Knew what you had in your bag.
There you go. Well done, sir. That was a very good effort. Well done, Miss Ray. Your analysis was very good too. And DJ Zoom. I think you got the scores bang on, Mr. Zoom. Well done.
I disagree. I think they were rubbish.
It's all the note taking.
Yeah, it distracted you.
It actually works when you listen.
I kind of get more points when he doesn't listen, to be fair.
Okay, then, guys. Well, thanks very much for tuning in and listening this week from the Maverick, the Brains, the DJ, and me, Mr. Perkins. Goodbye, all.
Bye.
Bye.